On Thanksgiving Day of 2012, Byron David Smith, a retired security engineering officer with the U.S. State Department, walked solemnly and silently into his basement, sat down with a rifle, and waited. The house was dark, and he had taken the extra step of hiding his truck so that it appeared he wasn't home. His home had been burglarized several times in the past few months, and Byron had enough. It was time to take matters into his own hands. As he sat there, two teenagers, aged 17 and 18, started to circle the property, making sure that there was no one there before they broke in, while Smith lay in wait. Chaos ensued, glass shattering, screaming, and then gunshots. Byron Smith had shot and killed both of these teenagers, and then, after all had gone quiet, he said, quote, "I refuse to live in fear. I am not a bleeding heart liberal. I feel like I was cleaning up a mess. I was doing my civic duty. I do not see them as human. I see them as vermin." Hello, I'm Anna, and this is episode 43 of the Crime Bistro podcast. Today we are going to be discussing the case of Byron David Smith just in time for Thanksgiving because that is when his crimes take place. And I am so sorry in advance for this entire episode and how it sounds because I obviously have a cold. I've been waiting all week to record this episode and it's only gotten worse, of course. So now it's Friday and there's nothing else I can do about it. I just have to sit down and record this. I'm sorry. I can't help it. But anyway, Byron David Smith. This is a really interesting case because it does prompt discussions about the right to defend your own property, and the Sixth Amendment gets brought up a lot during the trial and its aftermath. It's always fascinating to talk about cases like this, especially when there are everyday applications to rulings that are made in the case, but of course it's also a really important story in general to tell. All that being said, don't be fooled by the fact that I am calling this a Thanksgiving episode here. This case has some incredibly gruesome details to it, so just be prepared that it is pretty violent at times. We're definitely going to need some caffeine for this one. So with me right now, I have an elderberry lemon tea, which is actually really good. Kind of killing two birds with one stone, like caffeine and tea, because, again, I'm sick. So grab your own coffee, caffeinated beverage, or emotional support water bottle, and let's get into the case of Byron David Smith, the Thanksgiving Day killer. Byron David Smith was born on June 11th of 1948 in Little Falls, Minnesota, to his parents Ted and Ida Smith, and he also had a brother growing up. From all accounts, his childhood was pretty normal. He joined the Boy Scouts when he was young, and he even advanced to become an Eagle Scout, which is a really big accomplishment. And besides that, he was very outdoorsy and hardworking, even as a young kid. Byron always worked really hard to impress his parents, especially his father, Ted, who was a decorated World War II veteran, and all of this work really did pay off when he graduated from Little Falls High School second in his class, which is really impressive. He did follow in his father's footsteps, and after going to college, he would join the Air Force as an electrical engineer, and he was given the job of working on B-52 bomber airplanes during the Vietnam War, and he would even serve as an in-flight engineer, for which he earned a Commendation Medal. He was also awarded the Air Combat Medal and several other medals and awards throughout his career with the Air Force, so he was extremely highly regarded by other members of the military, and he was very successful. After leaving the military, Byron enrolled at California Polytech University to study electrical engineering, which was an area of study that allowed him to later get a job with the U.S. Department of State as a technical security engineer. This was another venture which Byron was incredibly successful at, and he traveled the world implementing security systems for U.S. embassies, which is no small task and really makes me wonder what his IQ is. This was a really high-stress and very involved job, however, which I'm sure played a factor in his retirement in 2009 after 20 years with the Department of State. When Byron retired, he moved back to Little Falls, Minnesota, and moved in with his mother, Ida, as his father had passed away in the late 1990s. Sadly, though, only 4 years into his retirement, Byron's mother would also pass away, leaving him alone in his childhood home, which was very important to him. He spent a lot of time outside, but he also spent a lot of time working on the house and the yard, maintaining and improving it. He was also very involved with the local Boy Scouts, an organization which had been so important to him as a child. And Byron didn't really have a family of his own at this point, so being involved in the local community was very important to him. He hired a group of local boys to help him out around the house in the summer of 2011, and this was basically an attempt to help connect with them and guide them down the right path for their futures. He would pay them to do odd jobs around his property, but after a while, Byron started to notice some little things that were concerning to him. Objects that were either being misplaced or that had gone missing entirely. At first, Byron didn't say anything, but consider the career path that he had taken. Byron was not someone who was going to be misplacing things or losing them on his own. He was extremely detail-oriented, and again, this property and the home meant a lot to him. He began to feel like it was this group of boys who he had hired who were messing with his things, which was really frustrating to him, but Byron didn't confront them about it. He just decided that he wasn't going to be hiring them back for the following summer. However, it wasn't just Byron who was noticing these things. Other locals said that in 2011 and 2012, they had noticed a lot more crime in their town, including substance abuse, vandalism, and robberies. These were mostly crimes that were just being committed by bored teenagers who didn't feel like there was anything else to do around town. But it's important to know that vandalism and robberies were becoming increasingly bigger of a problem in Little Falls. Byron had become exasperated and extremely angry in the months leading up to Thanksgiving Day of 2012, which was November 22nd, actually the same day that I'm recording this. His house in Little Falls, Minnesota had been burglarized several times, and with each subsequent break-in, his anger was only growing and festering. And we're not talking about like just a couple of incidents here. This happened about a dozen times. He had installed an alarm system and had also installed several security cameras that were in different locations around the outside of the house, one of which pointed straight at his driveway. Smith did have his suspicions about who had been responsible for these break-ins, but he didn't actually have any proof. He thought that it was two local teenagers, Haley Elaine Kiefer, who was 18, and her cousin Nicholas Brady, who was 17. By the time Thanksgiving Day arrived, Smith had decided that he only had one option, taking matters into his own hands. He had been visiting with a neighbor around 11 a.m. when he saw a car drive slowly by his house, and he told the neighbor that he needed to, quote, go prepare. The security camera that Smith had installed facing his driveway showed that he moved his truck from the driveway, which made it look like he wasn't home. He checked that his cameras were all working and made sure that he had tape recorders all over the house that were all turned on. He picked up a tape recorder, his rifle, and then slunk down to the basement of his home where he waited in silence, sitting on his reading chair. Interestingly, Byron only had one phone in his house, and it wasn't even in the basement, so he had almost put himself into a situation where even if he wanted to, he couldn't call 911. As he was sitting there, the two teenagers who he suspected approached his house, and they can be seen on security cameras moving around the outside of the home, and he even thought that he heard them jiggling the doorknob. Haley Kiefer and Nicholas Brady appeared to be making sure that there was nobody home, and Nicholas even attempted to tamper with one of the security cameras. When they were reasonably confident that the Smith house was empty, they decided to break in, smashing a window with a metal pipe. I do want to say this would be a scary situation to be in for anybody. So much had already been stolen from Byron and from his home, he could no longer feel safe in his own house, and he didn't have any idea what the intentions were of these robbers, and he didn't even know if they were armed. Because of the tape recordings, we do have a pretty good picture of how everything happened once the intruders were inside the home, and these tape recordings are truly haunting. You can hear shots ringing out and different things that Smith was saying both during and after the murders. Nicholas came to the basement first, and Byron shot him several times. Once he was sure that Nicholas was dead, he can be heard on the recording saying, quote, "You're dead," and then moving his body onto a tarp so that blood didn't get on his carpet. Nicholas had been the one to break in, and Haley was waiting outside the house for him to let her in, but when he didn't appear, she decided to just enter the house on her own through that same broken window. Apparently, she had not heard the gunshots, and it had been about 10 minutes, so by then Byron had gathered himself and he was sitting back in his reading chair, having already reloaded his gun. Haley can be heard calling for Nicholas as she approached the basement door, and when she opened it, Byron shot her once, but after that, his gun jammed. You can hear him say, quote, "Sorry about that," and then he pulled out his revolver, shooting her 4 more times. During this, you can hear him call Haley Kiefer a bitch, and he says, quote, "Cute. I'm sure she thought she was a real pro." He went to drag her body onto the same tarp and realized that she was still breathing, so he decided then to issue the final gunshot at point-blank range, killing Haley instantly. And after that final shot, the tapes were still recording, catching Byron saying a lot of things that really just did not make sense. This was lots of whispers and repeating himself constantly. It's extremely strange. Smith said things like, quote, "I refuse to live in fear. I am not a bleeding heart liberal. I felt like I was cleaning up a mess. I was doing my civic duty. I don't see them as human. I see them as vermin. It's all fun and games until someone shoots you. I refuse to live with that level of fear in my life." And this really just sounded like incoherent ramblings, like the ramblings of someone who was either extremely ill or who had just completely snapped and was having some sort of mental episode. He said a lot more throughout the recordings as well that had a similar degree of craziness, really. That's the only way to describe how listening to these makes you feel about him. And another aspect of this story that is particularly disturbing, Smith stayed with the 2 teenagers' dead bodies in his home until the next day when the police would finally be called. And the reason for this was that he didn't want to bother the investigators on the Thanksgiving holiday. It's also pretty clear after knowing all of the scary things that he said and that his mental state was likely extremely bad that he probably needed some time to calm down and process before he would be able to talk to the police or anyone else at all. This case is definitely unique because there's no doubt about what happened, the sequence of events, or who committed what crimes here. But before we get into the trial, I want to tell you about Nicholas Brady and Haley Kiefer because they really were just 2 teenagers, and teenagers make stupid mistakes all of the time. Despite the callous and horrific remarks that Byron was making towards them, these were 2 very bright young people with their lives all the way still ahead of them. I mean, let's be honest, at 17 and 18, you still can't completely comprehend the potentially life-changing impact that one decision can have. Nicholas Brady was born on March 21st of 1995 to his parents Jason and Kimberly Brady. Jason and Kimberly did have some issues with the police themselves, mostly for substance possession, but this meant that Nicholas and his sisters would spend a lot of time with his grandparents throughout their childhoods, who took really good care of them. His grandparents allowed him to play basketball and be on the wrestling team in high school, and he also loved spending a lot of time outside. He was described as goofy and funny, and he was really popular in high school, and you can really tell from photos of him back then that he was just very outgoing and a lot of fun to be around. During his high school years, Nicholas spent a lot of time with his sister Rachel and their cousin Haley Kiefer, and the 3 of them really have been described as inseparable. Haley was born on October 17th of 1994 to her parents Jay and Jenny Kiefer, and she had an older brother named Dylan. And she's described very similarly to Nicholas, so it makes sense that they got along so well. Haley was really smart, very popular, and athletic. In high school, she did gymnastics, softball, and competitive diving, as well as cross country, so she was really, really busy. Haley and Nicholas really did grow up together, and their families have so many years' worth of memories of them going back to when they were just babies. In 2011, Nicholas had been making some other friends since him and Haley didn't go to the same high school, so he started spending time with two boys his age named Jesse and Cody who went to school with him. When Nicholas introduced them to Haley and his sister Rachel, that's when things started to get a little out of hand. Jesse and Cody were not exactly the right crowd to be around, so they all started to commit minor crimes together like vandalism and underage drinking and other substances. Nicholas, Cody, and Jesse were really good friends by the summer of 2011 when they all started to work together on Byron Smith's property. This is where Byron and Nicholas first came into contact. I mentioned earlier that Byron had noticed things were starting to go missing during the summer of 2011 and that he suspected the boys who were working on his land, and that is exactly what was happening. Nicholas, Jesse, and Cody were taking things from him, and they were taking anything that they thought they could potentially sell. When that summer ended, they all went back to school, leaving their work at Byron's property, but not changing any of their other behaviors or habits. Though it is said that Haley and Nicholas seriously increased their use of substances. Nicholas, Jesse, and Cody were thinking about going back to work at Byron's for another summer, not realizing that he had picked up on their activities and that he wasn't planning on inviting them back. And Byron never told the boys why he didn't want them back, but all he told them was that he didn't need any help that year. And I do think it's interesting the way that he phrased it and why he didn't confront them, because the way that he said it really seemed to have upset the boys because they didn't know the reason for this. The boys had lost their summer plans, but Byron definitely hadn't, and he was going to have his hands full. In the summer of 2012, he was planning to renovate an investment property that he had recently purchased from himself, also in Little Falls, but a little ways away from his home. This new house was located on Elm Street. It was this home that seemed to become the target for local teenagers. It was vandalized one night to the point that nearly the entire interior was destroyed. Byron had also been waking up in the middle of the night nearly every single night to someone ringing his doorbell and running away, which is when he first started to consider installing some security cameras. And this wasn't as innocent as just a couple of ding-dong ditches. He also had a significant amount of cash that was stolen out of his bedroom. He always kept some in there to use at flea markets and antique shops because that was a really big hobby of his, but it was about $3,000 in total that was stolen from him. Because of this incident, Byron decided to put up cameras all around the exterior of his home by September of 2012. By September, Byron had noticed more and more instances of things being stolen, and he really started to get upset. Neighbors of his said that he seemed extremely agitated and almost paranoid at times. And I can imagine that a career in the Air Force, spending time overseas during the Vietnam War, and then working as a security engineer for 20 years would only exacerbate this feeling of having your own space be violated. He was also having a lot of trouble sleeping, which is understandable because of those ding-dong ditches, but this really did not help his mental state. One of the finishing touches that Byron put on his security system was to set up a space in his finished basement where he could have security cameras that were live feeding down to monitors, making sure to record everything. But the break-ins continued somehow, and on one occasion, Byron noticed that 2 of his guns had been stolen, which was obviously very alarming to him. The changes in Byron's behavior and his personality and his agitation at these incidents got exponentially worse and really, really fast. He started to act almost neurotic, developing an obsession with this security system and constantly displaying paranoia about his home. And in October of 2012, another incident occurred that really just seemed to make something in Byron completely snap. While he was out of town for a night, over $50,000 worth of items were stolen from him. This included several items from his late parents that were legitimately irreplaceable, which really is heartbreaking, and Byron was completely devastated to have lost those things. Unfortunately, Byron couldn't go to the police with his own suspects because he didn't have any proof, but he thought it was Nicholas, Jesse, and Cody, who he had denied for jobs at the beginning of the summer. This group included Haley and sometimes Rachel as well, and Byron didn't know this at the time, but they had all become basically regulars at committing robberies, not only at his home, but other homes and cars around Little Falls. By December 22nd of 2012, Thanksgiving Day, everything had combined to create what seemed to be a perfect storm for Byron. The burglaries, the paranoia, the lack of evidence, lack of sleep, neurotic behavior, security cameras, his guns being stolen, and it was that day when he decided that enough was enough. He lay in wait in the dark and he viciously defended his home, seemingly the only way that his traumatized brain knew how to, and this was that fateful Thanksgiving that changed everything. On November 22nd, when Nicholas and Haley had their fateful encounter with Byron, Nicholas's sister Rachel knew what their plans had been for that day. This is why when her parents started to get concerned later on, she didn't say anything right away. She knew that they were going to be committing a robbery at Byron's home. Going back to Byron's point of view, on the morning that he killed Nicholas and Haley, Byron didn't immediately call the police. Instead, he called a neighbor and asked for the number of an attorney. It was this neighbor who called the police, and actually the neighbor called and told the police that he thought it was Byron who might need help because of the frequent break-ins to his home. When the police arrived, Byron exited his home with his hands above his head, telling them that he wasn't carrying any firearms, which police thought was kind of weird. But remember his career in the military, Byron would have known exactly what the procedure would have been in a case like this. That being said, Byron's demeanor did not suggest that the scene was as horrific as what they came across in his basement, and police were absolutely shocked by what they saw down there. Nicholas Brady and Haley Kiefer had been reported missing, so the police officers recognized them as soon as they saw them, wrapped in tarps in Byron's basement, and the news was broken to the families later that same day, November 23rd of 2012. Byron was taken to the police station for questioning, and he was extremely open and very cooperative with police about how all of this had played out, and he was even honest about the fact that he had used excessive force, that he had shot them many more times than was necessary to stop the threat to himself and to his home. So now we've heard two sides to this story. There's a version of events where Byron had become so angry and so cold that he tried to lure in the burglars by making it seem like he wasn't home while he was waiting for them, knowing that his plan was to kill them and nothing less. But we've also heard a version of events where a man living on his own, after having a long, trying, and likely extremely stressful career, suddenly found himself to be the unwitting victim of serial burglars through no fault of his own. He was woken up in the middle of the night constantly, made to feel unsafe, and had lost the most meaningful and sentimental items that he owned. In this version, Byron really was a victim, and his actions were not callous or violent, but desperate and born of fear. Either way, police knew that he was the one who had killed Nicholas and Haley without a doubt, so his trial was going to be the determinator now. Which version of events is true? Premeditation or self-defense? For Smith's trial, the defense planned to base their arguments on the Castle Doctrine. This is actually a very old law. It's a 17th century common law that states that individuals have the right to defend their property against trespassers, that retaliating against a trespasser essentially constitutes self-defense. Today, this law applies to someone's right to defend their property against a perceived threat before the perceived threat even moves to potentially attack or cause harm. The castle doctrine itself remained unchanged from the 17th century until 2005, when Florida would be the first state to enact a stand your ground law, which greatly broadened the legal bounds of the castle doctrine. The stand your ground law would now include not only a person's property, but any space where someone felt threatened. This may sound very similar to self-defense, but it's actually very different. In the case of self-defense, a defendant carries most of the burden of proof, and they have to prove that they were not the instigator of a dispute and that they were in a situation so threatening there was no option except to use force to protect themselves. Interestingly, and kind of scarily, the Stand Your Ground law didn't carry these same specifications, and it didn't really require a lot of proof that there was any genuine threat. And this was, as I'm sure you can imagine, really bad. Studies showed that the enactment of the Stand Your Ground law correlated with a 24.4% increase in homicides and a 31.6% increase in firearm-related homicides in the state of Florida. And the passing of the Stand Your Ground laws seems to be a pointed effort by the National Rifle Association that started to span multiple states very quickly. A Harvard law professor named Jeannie Suk would speak on the spread of the Stand Your Ground laws, saying, quote, "The National Rifle Association at the time stated its intention to do it in Florida and then use it as a jumping off point for a sweeping change in self-defense law across the country. They were not at all shy or apologetic about that. This was the goal." Now that was a lot of legal talk, but the end result is basically this. When you're using this type of defense, you don't really have to prove that you were ever legitimately in danger, and you can still claim self-defense under the grounds of the Stand Your Ground law in court. In the case of Byron Smith, he had clearly gone overboard, shooting at Haley Kiefer and Nicholas Brady even after they were already deceased. Overkill in any kind of murder investigation usually is a clear indication of rage, and sometimes even blind rage. It's seen in a lot of cases where there is a desire for revenge, retribution, or a personal dispute. But Smith didn't really have a clear motive as to why he had been so violent. He only told investigators, quote, "If you're trying to shoot somebody and they laugh at you, you go again." Unfortunately for his defense team, however, it was clear to prosecutors that such an excessive amount of violence could not fall under the castle doctrine, and it was not indicative of self-defense. The prosecution also relied heavily on the sequence of events and all that Byron had done that day. They told the court about how he had moved his truck, how he had started the tape recorders and hid with his rifle, and argued that all of these things showed that he was trying to lure burglars to his home. What it showed, according to the prosecutors, was that Byron had premeditated the murder of these two teenagers, since he suspected they were the ones who had broken into his home before. He was hoping that day they would try again, and so he made it appear as if he wasn't there, when really he was sitting in the dark, like someone out of a horror movie. I cannot even imagine what the scene must have been in the courtroom for these moments, but the prosecution played all of the audio tapes that Smith had taken during the killings, and this was a huge aspect of the trial. All of these tapes are available online, so if you do want to listen to them to get a better idea of what Byron was saying and what his mental state might have been, they're there and they are available, but I'm not going to play them in this episode for you because they are really disturbing and really very haunting, so proceed at your own risk if you do decide to look any of that up. Interestingly, the judge did decide not to allow the defense to present any information about the teenagers' previous criminal activity because there was no concrete evidence to prove that Haley and Nicholas had been the ones to break into his home before, and there was no way for Byron to know who they were when he shot them. This does make sense from a legal point of view, but it is kind of a point of contention, and it makes some people believe that the jury didn't have all the context they needed to understand Byron's state of mind. The prosecution made an extremely compelling case to the jury, and in April of 2014, they officially returned with a verdict. Smith was convicted on 4 counts of murder, and following the conviction, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And just to clarify, it was first-degree murder that he was charged with. One of the jurors said later that it was really the audio tapes from the day of the murder that made them believe it was murder and not self-defense. They heard his statements and were horrified by the violence, callousness, and coldness in his voice. After the trial, this juror was quoted saying, quote, "We were dealing with a deranged individual." The belief among the jury was that if Byron was only trying to defend himself, he would have only fired 1 or 2 shots at each of the teenagers in his home, which would have been enough to incapacitate them so that he could go upstairs and call the police. It also seemed that the fact that Byron had shot Haley under the chin after realizing that she was still alive after the first 5 times that he had shot her showed blatant intent to kill. That final gunshot and act of violence was an execution-style homicide, and not an action that someone would take if they were only trying to defend themselves. Not to mention, it wasn't even Byron who called the police the next day, but it was his neighbor instead. This case is difficult, though, because while all of this may be true about Byron, the teens were essentially organized criminals. Stealing and breaking into people's homes was a common practice. It was something that they premeditated and something that they did knowingly and intentionally to make a profit by selling stolen goods. So that then begs the question, were these 2 teenagers who had just gotten caught up in activities like this without understanding the consequences of their actions and without understanding the gravity of the mistakes that they were making? Or were these 2 teenagers who knew exactly what they were doing and who had spent months terrorizing Byron and specifically targeting him because they were upset that he had not hired them back for that summer? It's interesting to think about since we know at that age your brain isn't fully developed, so that may also be a really big factor here. This case garnered a lot of national attention because it sparked debate over how far a homeowner can go to defend their property and to defend themselves. In March of 2021, news broke that the U.S. Supreme Court had declined to take up Smith's appeal. Smith's lawyers had been trying to appeal on the grounds that the courtroom was improperly closed to discuss the admissibility of witnesses, which deprived Byron Smith of his right to a public trial. They did also have a dissenting opinion to this as well, which is interesting. An associate justice named Sonia Sotomayor wrote that the Minnesota Supreme Court was in violation of Byron's rights when it ruled that administrative proceedings can be closed to the public. Minnesota officials did refute this claim quite strongly, though, saying that the proceeding being closed to the public was not in violation of Smith's Sixth Amendment rights because this non-public proceeding wasn't actually part of the trial. However, the U.S. District Court for Minnesota did make a concerning point, saying that the non-public proceeding was just one part of a, quote, broader and disturbing trend in Minnesota, and even Minnesota Supreme Court justices have expressed alarm over this issue, calling it, quote, creeping courtroom closure. But regardless, this was Byron's final appeal, meaning that he has exhausted all legal avenues for trying to get his conviction overturned or reevaluated in a court of law. So for now, that is the end of Byron's case, and he will remain in prison for the rest of his life. This case explores a lot of different avenues of the law, and it does bring up some really important questions. Was Byron driven to a state of paranoia and mania almost by the months' worth of break-ins, doorbells ringing in the dead of night, his security system being bypassed, his sentimental and precious items being stolen, his house being vandalized, and the police not doing anything to help him? Or does it really just come down to the fact that he continued to shoot at these two teenagers after they were no longer a threat to him, which means that his violence went beyond self-defense? His remarks on the audio tapes were demeaning, and they showed no remorse towards these teenagers and what he had done, but they might also be the remarks of a man who had truly just lost it and had some sort of mental break. And where Nicholas and Haley are concerned, were they really just two teenagers who had gotten caught up in something that they didn't understand the consequences of? Or were they maliciously targeting Byron for months leading up to that one fateful Thanksgiving when they broke into Byron's home for the last time? Does he deserve a sentence based on premeditation? Were his actions executionary rather than for the purpose of self-defense? The court has made their decision very clear, but I honestly am having a lot of trouble forming a true opinion here, on an overall basis, though I do firmly believe that Byron used an excessive amount of violence, and that if he were trying to protect himself, there would have been no reason for two teenagers to end up dead. That being said, though, I am dying to know what other people think about this case because it really does raise so many questions from a moral and legal standpoint, and it also raises questions about Nicholas and Haley's age and whether or not their incomplete brain development would have played a role in their judgment or their capacity for being impulsive. Let me know what you think, and if you are still listening, thank you so much for being here, for putting up with my sick person voice, and for tuning into this week's episode. I found this story really fascinating from so many different perspectives, and the recent conclusion is also really interesting, as well as the impact that it may have on everyone who finds themselves in a position where they need to protect themselves and their homes. But all of that being said, this is the case of Byron Smith, the Thanksgiving Day murderer. Thank you again for listening, and again, let me know what you think because this case is coming to a close. So, as always, until next time.